Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Keith W. Cook. Yeah, throwing the W in there. It was funny when George Bush was president, I kind of realized that I could also say W. So I've been doing that ever since, no matter how bad of a joke it really is. So, this week has been pretty crazy, right? I don't know where all of you are. We're located in California. Most of the GSMC podcast hosts are remote, but the headquarters is in California. So, just about 2 hours outside of San Francisco. So, we're not on the shelter-in-place order just yet from the coronavirus, but it's definitely been a little crazy. Should definitely keep people in your thoughts and prayers, whatever you subscribe to for your spiritual affinity. A lot of businesses are being forced to close for like weeks at a time. Grocery stores are being bought out of a lot of their like staple items pretty much daily. Whoever thought that eggs would become a commodity? I know a lot of my friends are talking about how like, oh, there's eggs at this place. Hurry before they're gone. Like, it's just very interesting. It feels a little bit like a sci-fi apocalypse novel by like Michael Crichton or something, which, if I remember correctly, he wrote Omega, Android, or Anadrome Omega or something like that. And that was kind of like a infectious disease along with Swarm, but that was more with nanobots. So anyway, yeah, definitely has been weird. It all feels a little ridiculous, but hey, if you're looking for a sense of normalcy, then here I am to deliver some non-anxiety inducing thoughts on post-apocalyptic literature, but we'll get to more on that later. I thought that it was a fitting thing for us to talk about this week. I know first and foremost that a lot of us are going to be spending substantially more time at home than normal. And I put normal in air quotes just because some of us haven't really changed our routines all that much at all. I know that I work remotely for my 9-to-5 grind job, so things haven't really changed much for me. But I know that a lot of people are not in that boat. They are definitely going through a lot of changes, kids being sent home from school and things like that. So I just wanted to give a bunch of suggestions kind of at the top of the podcast as to things that you could, like fun media you could consume during your time in either shelter in place or quarantine or, you know, social isolation as a lot of people are calling it, or social distancing. So I'm just going to go through some general recommendations that maybe don't fit into the science fiction genre, but I've found them to be really enjoyable nonetheless. And you'll probably get to know a little bit more about me in the process, which I feel like there's a lot of content that goes into these podcasts, so maybe I don't get to talk about myself as much or the things that I like. So here's some suggestions that I have for you as far as things that you could do while you are distancing yourself socially and waiting for this all to kind of blow over. So if you're into podcasts, which I imagine that you are since you're here, then I highly recommend binging a show called Hello from the Magic Tavern. Now, it is not necessarily a sci-fi. It's a fantasy podcast, but it's pretty good. It's very silly, so, fair warning. The premise of the show is that the host, Arnie Niekamp, who he writes for the Jackbox games. So if you've ever played those at a party, then you probably have heard his voice. I know I heard his podcast first and then played a Jackbox game. I was like, oh, that's Arnie Niekamp. So I thought that was pretty funny. So the host, Arnie Niekamp, has fallen through an interdimensional portal into another world. And this world is kind of like it starts out as a standard fantasy world. But the podcast is mostly improvised, if not entirely. So you can imagine that they stray pretty far from like your typical fantasy podcast tropes, which is a lot of fun. The show is pretty innovative and exciting on your first listen. So for the first few episodes, it definitely intrigued me just on the premise alone. And it's kind of like a slow burn, dry humor type podcast. It grows on you the more you listen to it. I think they're on like season 4. They've done a pretty consistent number of episodes every season, and there is a continuous plot, so you should definitely start from the beginning rather than from the middle. And it's available on most podcasting networks. Also, if you're into podcasts that are a little bit more formal, then I highly recommend Myths and Legends. It's by a gentleman named Jason Weiser, I believe. His wife, Carissa Weiser, also does a lot of like the post-production and the music and other miscellaneous aspects of the podcast. And this podcast retells the legends and mythologies of ancient times in a modern and accessible way. There are episodes spanning from Greek mythology to obscure like Samoan or Filipino lore. He has some podcasts on the lore of New Zealand, which are actually pretty interesting. It ends up being that particular one's very similar to like Hawaiian folklore or Hawaiian mythology, as you can imagine. Kind of the Pacific Islands in general, it all kind of bleeds together the same way that like Greek and Roman and some of those other, like even Norse to a degree, it all bleeds together in some capacity. I really can't recommend this podcast enough. It's very good. I've been listening to it for years, and I have loved pretty much every episode. Jason does a really good job of being a compelling storyteller. He rewrites a lot of the dialogue so that it feels more modern, and it also gives you a ton of interesting factoids to share with your friends about things that they thought that they knew a bunch about. So I definitely like it. And he also has a podcast on like classic stories. I think it's currently on hiatus, and I believe it's called Fictional. And that one is really good as well. He does a similar thing. Like he's done a couple of H.G. Wells stories. I think he did Frankenstein as well. He mostly does things that I believe are like either really close to or are easy to acquire the copyright for. Close to being public domain, that is. So he definitely does a great job with that as well. So you should check out both those podcasts. That's Fictional and Myths and Legends. And then, of course, I can't recommend enough the other offerings on the GSMC podcast network. We have a lot of great hosts who put a lot of time and effort into the shows that they do. I am the co-host on 2 other shows on this network, the movie and the music podcast. I co-host with Cynthia, who is also the host of a couple of her own podcasts individually. I believe she does entertainment as well as nutrition or general health or something along those lines. And all of those podcasts are great listens if you're into stuff like that. There's podcasts on TV shows. There's podcasts on books. So definitely check those out if you're looking for some more stuff to kind of just have playing throughout your day as you are stuck in your house. And then if you're not so much into listening to a bunch of podcasts, and if you're a reader, then I have a couple of suggestions as to things that would be really interesting. I mentioned the Hyperion book series by Dan Simmons in a couple previous episodes to this. And this is a series that's based loosely on the poem or poems of the same name by John Keats, written in a stylistically similar fashion to the Canterbury Tales as well, which makes for a pretty fascinating book in my opinion. The book premise is as follows. In the 29th century, the hegemony of man comprises thousands of planets connected by Farcaster portals. The hegemony maintains an uneasy alliance with the Technocore, a civilization of AIs. Modified humans known as ousters live in space stations between stars, and they are engaged in active conflict with the hegemony. Numerous outback planets have no Farcasters and cannot be accessed without incurring significant time dilation. And I believe that that's like the amount of time that it takes to travel between planets. So like it's kind of like how in Ender's Game, when he's out in space, he's gone for longer than he actually is gone. So he stays younger for a longer period of time than like his sister does, for instance. One of the planets in this series is Hyperion, home to structures known as time tombs, which are moving backwards in time and are guarded by a legendary creature known as the Shrike. On the eve of an ouster invasion of Hyperion, a final pilgrimage to the time tombs has been organized. The pilgrims decide that they will each tell their tale of how they were chosen for that pilgrimage. I only am kind of going over this book again because, I mean, even though I covered it specifically last time, I don't think that I quite got to enough specifics to really give you guys a reason to read it other than my singing praises of how well it was written. And so I just wanted to mention it again because I'm sure that I'll probably talk about it in the next couple months as I progress through that particular book. And the other book that I would suggest to you, also one that I'm currently reading, I will share with you right after this quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. I am glad to be back. I know it felt like an eternity, but it was just a quick commercial break, I promise. So right before we went to break, I was just kind of talking about suggestions that I had for things that you could do that maybe weren't necessarily along that sci-fi vein during your COVID-19 shelter-in-place or quarantine or lockdown orders. And I was going to mention to you another book that I thought would be a really good read for a lot of people. It is called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor by Donald Robertson. I believe the title's actually a little bit longer. It has something to do with Marcus Aurelius in the title. Regardless, I'm currently listening to the ebook of this particular piece of work. I've really enjoyed the content so far. I had to slow down the reading speed just because the gentleman who wrote the book has a very thick, I believe, Irish or Scottish accent. So I might recommend slowing it down as well. He is very pleasant to listen to. It's the author of the book who is reading the book in the ebook that I am listening to. It focuses primarily on the writings of Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor who was well known for his Stoicism, which is the system of philosophy that the book advocates for as being a way by which an individual can, in fact, think like a Roman emperor, if not the way that an individual can do that. The book does kind of take a self-improvement focused path towards understanding and practicing Stoicism. So fair warning, you might feel a little convicted when you're listening to or reading it, but I think that that's a good thing ultimately. So those are my 4 suggestions for you during this really kind of like rough time. Hello from the Magic Tavern, Myths and Legends, both podcasts, also Fictional, which is another podcast. All of the GSMC podcast offerings, and then the Hyperion book series, as well as the book How to Think Like a Roman Emperor by Donald Robertson. So now we're going to kind of move into our main topic of discussion this week, the thing that you've all been waiting for. This week we're talking about something very similar to what we talked about last week, though it is a little bit more topical. It's kind of the antithetical version of utopia. Not dystopia necessarily, but most of these would be able to also fall into the category of dystopia. But what I specifically wanted to talk about this week was post-apocalyptic literature and movies. It's topical just because if you've been to a grocery store recently, like I mentioned earlier, it's just really slim pickings out there, and people have been prepping as if the world's about to end. I know that a couple friends of mine have been talking about how they've got X number of days in supplies, so if things go really south, they'll be good. They're stockpiling all sorts of resources in order to prepare themselves for some hypothetical impending quarantine. But I would just like to take a moment to remind people that the sky isn't falling and the world is not ending. You don't need to stockpile anything just yet, though it doesn't hurt to buy a little extra of some things that you need. I think that it's really important that we as individuals don't feed into the fear and stress of others by suddenly going full doomsday prepper just because we're a little nervous about the spread of a disease. And it is definitely a time of uncertainty, and we should absolutely be obeying any of the rules and restrictions that are put in place by individuals who are in positions to do so. So like your state congressman or your governor or mayor or what have you. We should respect those rules. They are for the sake of, the majority, a large portion of the population. The original estimates for the death toll, if there were no restrictions in place, is around 22 million. So that's about 7% of the population, which is a pretty substantial warning. But we, despite that, shouldn't be turning into animals and run around hoarding supplies like nuclear winter is inevitable or something like that. So that's my little soapbox statement about COVID-19. We should definitely be cautious and aware and keep ourselves up to date, but don't freak out too much. And if you're not freaking out too much, don't stress out that you're not freaking out, because it's a big deal, but it's not as big of a deal as a lot of people would have you believe, in my opinion. So, moving on to the main point of the discussion, post-apocalyptic media. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's defined as a subgenre of science fiction. For a novel to be post-apocalyptic, the setting must be one where the end of the world has already taken place and characters are trying to survive and start anew. And this is actually a pretty common genre that a lot of us are relatively familiar with without even realizing it, in my opinion, that is. Pretty much every zombie series or movie you've ever seen is firmly within this subgenre of science fiction. And I would argue that zombie-specific literature is a sub-genre of science fiction, which I think is, we could talk about zombie stuff for hours on end. It's definitely funny. Well, not funny. It's definitely interesting. What is funny is a meme that I saw the other day where someone was saying, I wished for zombies, not for coronavirus. So I thought that was pretty good. So because of the nature of science fiction and the fact that it's a speculative genre, it's pretty easy for authors and content creators to just kind of say, oh, the world is over. Okay, now what? So there's definitely been a lot of terrible pieces of fiction that have focused on this particular subject, but there's also been a lot of great ones. just as an example of something that I find to be pretty funny, the original Mad Max was pretty much destined to be one of those awful pieces of post-apocalyptic literature. Its budget was so low that most of their extras were paid in beer, and a lot of the like car chase scenes were shot without permits. So they would have to try to do a shot before the police could stop them from doing the shot or shut it down, which I think is pretty interesting. And this is during, this is in like the 1980s in Australia that they filmed this. So definitely kind of fun. And a lot of franchises, they just didn't have the same good fortune as Mad Max did. So there's a lot to sift through. So I kind of just wanted to share with you guys some more of my favorites, as well as like what it is that we as individuals find in this genre that is so appealing and why it is so pervasive throughout like the zeitgeist of science fiction media. Now, normally I feel like you would expect me to say something about how or why it is that all post-apocalyptic literature or media falls into the category of science fiction. But even I'm not that insufferable. It's all in the future, so it has to be science fiction. I mean, that's not totally true, but it's mostly true. The first piece that I want to talk about is the novel The Road by Cormac McCarthy. McCarthy is a well-known and critically acclaimed author, and The Road is probably pretty close to being his magnum opus as far as the world of literature is concerned. Some people might say that it's like Blood Meridian or something along those lines. But what makes it such a good piece of literature? The Road focuses on the journey of two characters. They are known throughout the book as the man and the boy. And as they travel through post-apocalyptic America, specifically they're heading south along the eastern coast of the U.S., McCarthy uses this post-apocalyptic world to kind of examine a lot of different aspects of the human experience and what the human experience looks like in a post-apocalyptic world. Stylistically, the book is written impeccably, and it's full of a ton of beautiful metaphoric language. There's a pretty heavy undertone of religious elements throughout the novel, which adds to the quality of the writing, in my opinion. But I think that one of the reasons that this book is so great is because it's shrouded in obscurity. Even the mass extinction event that caused the post-apocalyptic elements of the setting is never fully explained. And that also, I mean, the obscurity of everything in the book is also contributed to by the fact that the primary characters of the book are never named. But what is very real about the book is the hyper-violent and difficult challenges, or are the hyper-violent and difficult challenges that the boy and the man face throughout their journey. And this juxtaposition between the obfuscation of the abstract of memory and identity and the concrete visceral experience of the harsh reality around them helps to emphasize some of the primary thematic elements of the novel. And this is where we're going to get into some more familiar territory. A couple podcasts ago, I spent a substantial amount of time talking about the idea of cognitive distancing, which is pretty different from social distancing. Great topical dad joke there. Where we as individuals, in order to engage with a story and the self-reflection involved in engaging with a story, are forced to conceptualize a world or a technology that is so unfamiliar to us as individuals that it puts us in a place of emotional and metaphysical vulnerability and forces us into that space of reflection. Post-apocalyptic literature is especially effective at doing this because it gives us a sort of blank slate to operate from. Because a majority of civilization has been eliminated via some sort of catastrophe. Hence why this is kind of like a semi-topical thing to discuss currently. And on that note, we're going to take one or another quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back yet again. I'm Keith, in case you needed a reminder. Right before we went to break, we were kind of talking about why it is that a lot of people really like post-apocalyptic media or literature. And we kind of mentioned this idea of the blank slate. So the blank slate is an idea that's pretty commonly used as a concept in philosophy. Though usually in philosophy it's referring more to the development of an individual's moral or sociological interactions with the world. So like a tabula rasa type of thing. John Locke, I think, is the one who kind of coined that particular phrase. And it has more to do with that than anything else usually. But in this particular case, it serves as an excellent mechanism for us to understand better the development of morality and ethics in individuals throughout a given society, not specifically in their upbringing or their socializing to the world around them. And part of what is so appealing with the particular type of cognitive distancing solicited by post-apocalyptic literature is that it has a tendency to reveal the truer nature of humanity. That the true nature of humanity is revealed more during a post-apocalyptic occurrence, at least in its conjecture as to how humanity would act in that situation. Would we turn to violence and cannibalism in order to survive? Or would the goodness of humanity emerge under these types of incredibly stressful situations? I think that a lot more people, along with McCarthy himself, would say that individuals would turn pretty quickly to the more violent aspects of human behavior when given the opportunity. If you look at a lot of post-apocalyptic literature, you would also notice a pretty common tendency for a rearrangement of society into a very strict system of haves and have-nots, which is a more basic understanding of society compared to what we have now. Because what we have now is a lot of gray area where it's kind of like, well, this person has a little bit of this and this person has a little bit of that. And then, religion or science or politicians will try to say that some person has this and this is why their life is happy and they don't need material wealth or things like that. But when you get into post-apocalyptic literature and media, what you'll have a tendency to find is that those hierarchies become much more simplified. Quite frequently, it has to do a lot with like physical strength, which plays on a particular fantasy that a lot of individuals have where they think to themselves, I'm strong enough to take this from somebody else. But the reason that I don't do that is because of the sociological ramifications of that particular act. And when you remove those sociological inhibitions, then you end up with this society that can be more easily divided along the lines of physical strength or, in a lot of cases, cunning. It's not necessarily a good movie, but Waterworld could be an example of this, where there's definitely a group of haves and have-nots, and the have-nots take a lot from the haves. And, of course, there's an entire plot line involving someone who's evolved gills, but we don't even need to get into that. And in McCarthy's novel, he does an interesting thing where society doesn't really exist in the form of haves and have-nots as far as like material or even physical strength is concerned. McCarthy's novel focuses on the haves and have-nots of morality and the way in which morality is shaped by the need to survive. There are a lot of really messed up parts in that book that are very dark. It's definitely an R-rated book. I haven't seen the movie. I've heard good things. Viggo Mortensen is an incredible actor, so I imagine that it's pretty good, just from my conjecture, and from the trailer as well, of course. But part of what makes The Road such a great novel is that it doesn't make the division of resources into something that is simplified. We're not just looking for shelter like you are in A Quiet Place, and you're not just looking for resources as you are in a lot of those like zombie kind of post-apocalyptic places where it's like, we're going to go to this place that has food and giant walls and blah, blah, blah. And like even in Planet of the Apes, which is a form of post-apocalyptic media, they're kind of divided along those lines as well. So it's just very interesting for us to be able to kind of take and examine those aspects of society through the lens of what if it didn't exist at all anymore. And another great example that I am only relatively familiar with is a science fiction post-apocalyptic movie called Snowpiercer. And now I haven't actually seen the whole movie, but I've done some research on the premise, and I think that it's a great example of a good use of like the way in which society divides itself when sociological pressures aren't as present. So the basic premise is that because of some sort of catastrophe, the scientists of Earth decided that they were going to incur a second ice age, but they did it improperly, and it made it so that the world could no longer support life on the surface. So they basically created this train called the Snowpiercer, which I believe is like a mile long or something along those lines, and is made up of a bunch of cars that travels in perpetuity around the world, I believe in like unison with the sun or something along those lines. I don't know exactly how it works. Like I said, I haven't seen the entire movie. But the main aspect that I like about it is that there is a decidedly present hierarchy between haves and have-nots, and that society has been completely reshaped based around haves and have-nots in the form of like economic power mainly. So wealthy and elite are at the front of this train, and they have tons of amenities and all these things that are just very nice and almost make life kind of pleasant for them. Whereas towards the back of the train and at the rear of the train, you have all of these individuals who have been denied resources, who do not share equal rights or equal access to amenities, which I think is very interesting that, you know, even on this train, which is only a mile long and houses a certain number of people, like even on this train, you have a pretty decided divide between haves and have-nots. And this is part of what is appealing about post-apocalyptic literature, is that when you watch it or read it, oftentimes we as individuals fantasize about being a member of the haves in that group. When you eliminate all social boundaries, it's kind of like the purge. It's a similar idea where we are suddenly allowed to act on all these basal instincts that we've had to repress for the sake of social approval. But when you remove all of those things, then you are no longer bound by the rules that everybody else has had to play by. And that kind of plays on this idea that we have in our heads that, society or politics or birthplace have screwed us in the general terms of life. So when you get into post-apocalyptic life, those things are eliminated. Now it's based on a completely different system, and we can more easily place ourselves into the halves of that system. Even in The Road, the main characters have a form of morality. They have a sense of good. And that is one of the main dividing factors that separates them from everybody else in the book. And as we come towards kind of the end of this podcast this week, I know it's a little bit shorter, I just wanted to mention the etymology of apocalypse, which in the Greek means to reveal something. And I think that the biggest reason that we as individuals like post-apocalyptic literature is because it shakes out all of those things that we think we know about humanity and reveals something deeper and sometimes more sinister, sometimes more heroic, sometimes just something that's more accessible to us as consumers of this particular medium. So we get the opportunity to have revealed to us what it looks like for people to be completely down and out. In McCarthy's book, when people are completely down and out, then they turn to cannibalism and violence and theft, and even the main characters who seem to have the presence of mind or the presence of conscience to act on what they believe is right, even their morality is brought into question or under attack by the morality of everybody around them. And this is just a much more basic level of examining the human experience, because we're removing the trappings and the preconceived notions that come along with being in society today. We as individuals are constantly berated by all of these factors that influence our behavior in different situations. And it's very nice to fantasize about, well, what if they were all gone? What if we got to be completely, or at least to a degree, be completely self-made, be completely self-reliant? And there is a deep and profound appeal to that. So that's pretty much all I have for you guys this week. I also wanted to mention just a couple of movies that I'll be talking about them in the movie podcast today, but just a couple more suggestions for you at the end of the podcast as to things that you could be doing during this, trying time. Definitely check out the movie I Am Legend. I really enjoy it. I know that supposedly the book is much better. I have not personally read the book, but I very much enjoyed the movie, and I think that it's worth a watch. And then I have been recently intrigued by Children of Men, or Children of Man. I can't remember exactly what the title is. It's another post-apocalyptic piece of film that has received a lot of critical acclaim for the ways in which it examines humanity when they are down and out. So that about covers it for me this week. Thank you for tuning in. Next week, assuming we are recording, I'll have another episode up for you guys, and I don't quite know what I'll be talking about then, but I'm sure that it will be super interesting. We might revisit this topic a little bit in a little bit more depth. So thanks again for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, give us a good review at the bottom. Definitely like and subscribe as well. Share with your friends. Tweet at us. All of those great things. So good luck, everybody who is in a situation where they're in shelter in place or quarantined or what have you. And I hope that you all are doing well. Have a good week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.